Hi everyone. Today we will be talking about ecosystem services, which is one of the lectures, and I'm asking you, well, I'm preparing this lecture beforehand because I would like you to get a background on ecosystem services, so that we can then actually have a discussion about this. We've had a look at a figure similar to this one when we spoke about habitat loss. This figure just shows you how various drivers, such as habitat change, climate change, invasive species, are affecting different vegetation types or habitat systems, and what the current drivers trends are. So, for example, whether they're increasing. So, as you can see, for example, that climate change is increasing across all systems. Whereas in temperate forests, habitat change is decreasing as a driving force of change, whereas in tropical forests, for example, it's increasing very rapidly. And then also what the impact of all these drivers are on biodiversity. And as you can see, habitat change has a really large impact on, for example, tropical and temperate grasslands. And a high impact on temperate forests and Mediterranean and systems together with grassland and savanna. Okay, so this is how we can interpret this figure. And we've spoken about habitat change and its impacts on biodiversity, but we want to now go a step further and think about habitat change and how it might be impacting human society or us as humans. Also, just to think about why should we be caring. Many of you are in this course because you are passionate about biodiversity or you're passionate about science, and some of you will not feel that way. And if we go outside the classroom, the number of people who don't really care about the environment will increase significantly. So one of the reasons we care about the environment is because the environment gives us ecosystem services and benefits. And I already spoke in class that we can define ecosystem services as the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. We can define ecosystem services, or we can divide them up into four categories. The first ones are supporting ecosystem services. These are ecosystem services that are necessary for the production of all other ecosystem services, and they include things like nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production, so the production of green material. And without these supporting ecosystem services, none of the other ecosystem services would function. The other ecosystem services we can divide into provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. Provisioning ecosystem services are services that give products to us. So these are services are services from biodiversity from which we directly benefit. So these are things that we would harvest from the environment, and they include things like food, such as root plants or berries, things like fresh water, which we also obtain from the environment, wood and fire, etc. Then we have regulating ecosystem services. These are benefits that are obtained from the regulation of ecosystem processes. And so, for example, if you have a healthy grassland, that grassland will be very effective in flood regulation. Right, so we can say that that grassland has regulating services. A tropical rainforest in an area where tropical rainforests are, well, a tropical rainforest would be very effective in climate regulation, for example. And then finally, we also consider cultural services. So these are usually recreational and non-material benefits that we obtain from the environment. And these are benefits that come out of us appreciating the environment. So, for example, it's been shown in many studies that getting out into nature is very healthy for one's mental state. Or some communities find certain areas or consider certain areas as being holy, or some of us enjoy going to national parks because we enjoy seeing wildlife. So all of those are considered to be cultural services. Okay, so now we've spoken about the definition of ecosystem services, and we want to think a little bit about ecosystem services in South Africa. And we really get a number of ecosystem services from our natural systems. These include things like grazing, medicinal plants and food, building material, carbon sequestration. So carbon sequestration is the ability of the vegetation to convert carbon dioxide into or a solid carbon form, and this helps in reducing carbon dioxide concentrations in the environment. So if you think about our grasslands, the forbs in the grasslands have extensive underground structures, and so they are extremely effective carbon storers. And then forests are also considered to be very effective carbon storers because they store carbon in woods. Water supply and contribution to groundwater and prevention of soil erosion. And we'll be talking a bit about these in the course of the lecture. And we will be specifically focusing on the grassland biome because it has been shown to be a hotspot of ecosystem services. It's also a hotspot of biodiversity in South Africa. And having said that, it's also sometimes an underappreciated biome in terms of what we think we get out of it compared to what we really get. So here are some maps showing you the ecosystem services that we obtain out of our systems. This is carbon sequestration. To map carbon sequestration is not all that easy. And you can see that in this diagram, the savannas have been considered to be high sources of carbon sequestration, or medium sources of carbon sequestration. And that's of course because they have many trees. And then the thicket biome is considered to be a particularly high source of carbon sequestration. And the reason for that is that Portulacaria afra, the speckboom, which you also had in your key prac, is considered to be particularly effective at sequestering carbon. What's not shown in the map is the impact of grasslands on carbon sequestration, and in more recent years, it's been shown that grasslands are actually extremely important for carbon sequestration because, as I mentioned previously, a lot of the forbs have underground organs in which they store carbon. So we could add the grasslands to this map. Then our ecosystem services are important for surface water supply. So these are areas where surface water runoff is very important. The study was done on the level of municipalities. That's why it looks so broken up. But you can see which areas are very important as sources of water. Then soil retention. So this is where the habitat is very important in prevention or preventing erosion. And then water flow regulation. So to ensure that water doesn't flow extremely fast or flow or cause a lot of erosion. And these are areas where the natural vegetation is really important. And water flow regulation. If you look at these maps, you can see that particularly the eastern part of the country has high ecosystem services. And we can sort of sum up these ecosystem services and look at ecosystem services production per municipality. And we can see that the eastern part of the country, and especially around KZN and the thicket biome in the Eastern Cape, the grassland and savanna biome in the Eastern Cape are thought to be very important sources for ecosystem services. And if we compare that map to the map of biomes of South Africa, we can see that the ecosystem services largely overlap here, the savannas and grassland regions. All right, so we'll be focusing on ecosystem goods and services in grasslands. There are a number of direct uses that we get out of grasslands. So, for example, they are very important for grazing. And then there are a number of medicinal plants, also because of the high biodiversity, particularly of these geophytes, the bulbous species. many of which have medicinal properties. And then we get some building material in terms of thatching. So these are the direct uses. Some of them are high, but generally they're not, but others are not that high. But then we also get a lot of indirect uses out of the grasslands. So the grasslands are extremely important for water supply. The grasslands are the sources of many of our major rivers, and they contribute about 40% of the mean annual runoff of water to South Africa. They're also very important for groundwater recharge, so there's a lot of water seeping into the ground and into groundwater stores in the grasslands. Then they are moderate to high for soil retention. They are low for above ground carbon sequestration, but as I mentioned, more recently it's been found that they are actually pretty high for below ground carbon sequestration. And we're going to hone in a little bit on water supply. So the Drakensberg obviously lie in the grassland biome, and they are extremely important for our water supply in South Africa, including our water supply here in Gauteng, because we actually get a lot of our water from the Drakensberg. So the Maluti Drakensberg areas supply about 25% of South Africa's water, and we as Gauteng get a lot of, as I said, get a lot of our water from the Drakensberg. First of all, the Drakensberg is a source to a number of major rivers, including the Tugela, the Orange, and the Vaal River. So we have over 8,000 million of cubic meters of water as a mean annual runoff. Right, and we consider plant cover to be really important in the hydrology of these systems, because plants play a very important role in filtration of the water. They buffer flood flows and they prevent soil erosion. Now, a lot of the water that we receive in Gauteng actually comes from Lesotho. You may have heard about some of the water transfer schemes in Lesotho, like the Gatse Dam. These are dams that are not within our own country, they're within our neighboring country, and the water from these dams gets transferred into the Vaal system, which then runs into the Vaal River, and that's where we here in Gauteng especially get a lot of our water. So you can imagine that what happens in Lesotho, which is not even within it's not within our own region, but it's actually not even within our own country. The land use practices in Lesotho affect us in South Africa, and especially here in Gauteng, very heavily. This picture on the slide was taken at one of these dams, and you can see the land use around there. There's some agricultural fields. There's also a lot of heavy grazing up in the Maluti Mountains, and much of the systems are actually degraded and quite heavily eroded up in the Maluti Mountains. Now, we in South Africa pay for the water. We don't pay for the grasslands being kept intact, even though we actually benefit from the grasslands being kept intact. And that's sort of a bit of an introduction into why ecosystem services are important and why it's important to value ecosystem services. So water is a prime example in Southern Africa or in South Africa, which is a service that we obtain from the ecosystem, and we pay for water, or the money we pay for water goes towards pipelines, and it goes towards water purification systems and paying jobs of people who work in these systems, but we don't actually pay money or contribute money to keeping those ecosystems from which we receive our water. Right, so there are a number of important grassland management factors that play a role. These include burning, so that's the timing and frequency of burning, grazing, stocking rate of grazing, so whether an area is overgrazed or not. And we can think about it in terms of this flow diagram. So if we have robust vegetation cover, we tend to have enhanced biodiversity, enhanced water flow and quality, and enhanced carbon sequestration. And that gives us a greater ecosystem service supply. which means that we get more enhanced consumption opportunities. So as the users of the habitats, we get more out of it. Now, this is where the circle often breaks, right? So at current, we don't, as I mentioned, we don't really pay for the benefit of robust vegetation cover. We just pay for the product itself. But a few people have now come up with a suggestion that we should really be paying for ecosystem services. So to pay for these indirect benefits that we receive from ecosystems, which can then be plowed back into management actions to close the circle. So, for example, in the grassland, in the Maluti water transfer systems I was referring to, if you were to have systems in place, if some of the money that we were to pay for our water would go back into protecting the grasslands around the grasslands of Lesotho, those could then ensure that we have robust vegetation cover and that we, the users, get more out of this. So at present, the dams of these transfer dams are rapidly filling up with soils. Also, there are sometimes sort of small earthquakes in the mountains because of the soils that get that gather in these big dams. So they have tremors. All of these are a danger to the water supply, of course. They're a danger to the local people, and you can imagine what happens if one of those dam walls were to break to downstream communities in South Africa. Right, so this brings us to the concept of economic valuation. So we can define economic valuation or think about it in terms of how we currently pay for ecosystem services and how we could pay for ecosystem services into the future. So at current, the value of something is equal to the exchange price paid for it. So you need to actually be trading something to for it to have value. So for example, for petrol, we pay for petrol and we pay for what we get, basically. Or for food, we pay for a bag of tomatoes and we get something. We get that bag for it. Under this view, natural resources have no value. So even for water, we are paying for water, but as I mentioned before, we are paying for the water that we use. We are paying for keeping the pipelines and all of that intact, but we are not actually paying for the natural resources that supply us that water. So the principle of economic valuation aims to address this market failure. In the current economic framework, so without the concept of economic valuation, grasslands don't really have a value because we use them for grazing and not for much else. But if we think about all the indirect benefits that we obtain from grasslands, and we value grassland in terms of those benefits, they are worth a lot more. So the way to think about economic valuation is to think about the use values and the non-use values of a system. So the direct uses, or the use values, include direct uses, indirect uses, and option uses. Direct uses are the things that we directly get from a system. So in a grassland, a direct use is, for example, the grazing that we obtain. The indirect uses are uses that we cannot really measure in terms of products, but they are of high use for us. So, for example, water filtration is an indirect use of grasslands. And then finally, we have option values. So option values are uses of these systems that we don't have at the moment, but we may want to use them in the future. So we may want to decide to not use a system or not mess up a system, not because we are using it now, but because we would like future generations to be able to extract the resources, so direct uses or indirect uses in the future. So those are the use values. Then the non-use values have to also be thought about. So these can be divided into existence values and bequest values. Existence values mean the values upon which we, or the fact that we value a system just for it existing. So if you think about our savannas, for example, we might not get a lot out of that savannas, but we enjoy going into those systems, and we just think that intrinsically those systems need to be able to continue existing. So we have a value for those systems just because we think that it's worth protecting them into the future. And then we also have bequest values, and these are as very similar, but here we don't value a system for what it is currently, but it's for future generations. So you may want to say, well, let's not plow up all the grasslands in South Africa because we want our future generations to know what a grassland is and to enjoy the biodiversity in that grassland. All right, so we can think about the environment in terms of all of these values. We think about grassland valuation. Go back to that. The idea is that ecosystem goods and services flowing from grasslands are not free goods. They do have a function and they should therefore be valued. Right? So we said direct values are things like market goods like medicinal plants or grazing. Indirect uses are ecological functions such as water supply. And then option is the willingness to pay to preserve the environment to use it later. And then the non-use values are the existence values. So it's the willingness to pay to preserve the environment just for having it. So we just value it for being there. And bequest value is to pay to preserve the environment for future generations. And again, a lot of this work was done some time ago, but the last sort of valuation that was done of grasslands in South Africa indicated that the grasslands are worth over 9 billion rand, and just in their values, and of course now it would be considered to be much higher, right? And these values are based only on consumptive use, non-consumptive use, and indirect use values, so they don't even include non-use values in here. So they really are worth to the country. Okay, so I will end with this. There's some. This is the reading that I'll be putting on ClickUp. But please make sure you do some of this reading, and that you come prepared then for the lecture on Friday, so that we can discuss some of these issues in class. Thank you.